The first sound was laughter. Not mine. His. Crystal glasses clinked under golden chandeliers, and 50 faces turned toward my husband as he raised his glass like a king addressing his court. The restaurant glowed in candlelight, but for me the room was already dark. 10 years, David declared, his smile sharpened like a blade. And to my wife, who knows her place. The guests chuckled politely, unsure if it was a joke. I smiled too, lips stiff against my teeth, because that's what you do when humiliation comes dressed as charm. I remember gripping the stem of my water glass, my knuckles whitening, the cool against my skin keeping me anchored. My reflection trembled in the rippling surface, 35, accomplished, invisible. That was me. Hillary Parker. The lawyer who'd closed million-dollar deals, drafted airtight contracts, out-argued senior partners in courtrooms where the walls reeked of tobacco and power. But here, under the gaze of friends and family, I was only David's wife. His trophy. His possession. The lie of it all was suffocating. If you looked closely, though, there were cracks in the mask. You would have seen the faint shadow beneath the concealer on my cheekbone. You would have noticed how my father never looked directly at me anymore, or how my mother's laugh always sounded like an apology. You would have caught the twitch in David's jaw when someone mentioned my career, an instinct he couldn't hide no matter how expensive the wine. I thought about the first time his hand landed on me. Not tonight, not yet, but years earlier, just 3 months after our vows, when I dared to celebrate a small promotion with champagne. His voice had been calm, measured. "Don't embarrass me again, Hillary." Then came the backhand, the sting blooming like fire across my skin. I'd told myself it was a mistake. A bad night. Every survivor knows that lie. Now here we were, 10 years later, dressed in designer clothes, eating food I couldn't taste, surrounded by people who thought wealth erased cruelty. "Smile," David whispered in my ear as waiters swept past with silver trays. "People are watching." He didn't know I'd been watching too. For years. Recording. Photographing. Collecting every bruise, every word, every threat like beads on a rosary of survival. He didn't know that beneath my dress was a phone loaded with evidence that could dismantle everything he built on arrogance and fraud. He didn't know that while he toasted to his empire was already on fire. But I knew. And that knowledge kept me steady, even as my parents pretended not to see, even as my sister scrolled her phone to avoid the tension in the air. The truth? I wasn't trapped anymore. Not really. I was waiting. Tonight was the stage I had chosen. The audience I had invited. The moment I had orchestrated with the precision of a trial lawyer lining up witnesses. David thought this dinner was his crowning moment. What he didn't realize was that it was also his execution. I caught my reflection again in the glass, eyes sharper now, harder, alive in a way they hadn't been for years. Beneath the makeup, beneath the silence, a different woman was breathing. Not the victim he trained me to be. Not the wife my parents pretended was fine. But the lawyer. The strategist. The woman who refused to vanish. The night was only beginning, and David Mitchell was already standing on the edge of his downfall. He just hadn't looked down yet. The applause for David's toast faded into the clatter of cutlery, but inside my chest, silence roared. My cheek still tingled from where his fingers had guided my face toward the crowd, a gesture he disguised as affection. To anyone else, it looked like intimacy. To me, it was a warning. I leaned back in my chair, feigning serenity. In reality, I was measuring every breath. One wrong move tonight, and the plan I had nursed for 2 years could unravel. I caught my mother's gaze across the table. She offered me the kind of smile meant to smooth over tension, the same smile she gave at Christmas when I'd arrived with a split lip. "Don't provoke him," she'd whispered then. That phrase had become a family prayer: hush the storm, keep the peace, pretend nothing's broken. My father was worse. He admired David. He called him ambitious, strong, a man who knew how to handle pressure. I'd heard their laughter behind closed doors, the word women tossed around like a punchline. My family had built a fortress of silence around my bruises, and I had learned to build a different one: secrecy. At work, I was Hillary Parker, sharp, commanding, relentless. At home, I shrank into the outline of someone else. I let David call me his little lawyer while hiding the truth. I out-earned him by millions. I let him believe he controlled every account while I tucked my bonuses into an untouched reserve he didn't know existed. For years, I lived a double life, publicly submissive, privately strategic. Every insult he hurled became another line in my journal, another time-stamped piece of evidence. Every shove became a photograph in a cloud he couldn't reach. Every empty threat became proof of a pattern. And then, 6 months ago, Margaret Chin entered my office. She was everything David feared in a woman: brilliant, unapologetic, powerful enough to build an empire without shrinking for anyone. She didn't mince words that day. "How long will you let him dim your light?" she asked, eyes steady, voice like a gavel. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. She already knew. That conversation was the moment my silence became a weapon. Margaret introduced me to Diane Winters, the divorce attorney who never. The corridor outside the dining room smelled faintly of polished wood and roses. I steadied myself against the cool marble wall, inhaling deeply, when a familiar voice drifted over my shoulder. "Hillary Parker," said James Morrison, a senior partner at a rival firm. His handshake was warm, his eyes sharper than most. "I hear congratulations are overdue. Margaret tells me you've outmaneuvered half her board." My throat tightened. Margaret had promised to keep the promotion under wraps until the timing was right. But Morrison's words were casual, genuine. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel it, the recognition I had been starved of in my own home. We spoke briefly, nothing more than polite professional exchange. But when I turned, David was there. His eyes burned with the suspicion of a man who saw threats in every shadow. His voice carried across the hallway, too loud, deliberately cruel. "Flirting at our anniversary dinner, Hillary?" Dozens of heads turned. My pulse surged, but my face stayed composed. "We were discussing work," I said evenly. "Work?" He laughed, ugly and raw. "You don't have work. You play dress-up in suits I pay for." His fingers clamped around my wrist like iron. "Come back to the table. Now." The restaurant hushed. Crystal forks paused midair. My parents watched without moving, my mother's eyes darting down as if silence were safety. David dragged me forward, and for the first time in years, I didn't shrink. I straightened, let the sting of his grip register on my skin, and turned to face the room. Did everyone see that clearly? My voice cut through the hush, calm but edged with steel. Or should he do it again? A gasp rippled across the tables. For a heartbeat, David faltered. Then his hand snapped across my face, swift, sharp, undeniable. The sound cracked against the vaulted ceiling like a gunshot. 50 witnesses. Perfect silence. The world holding its breath. Heat exploded across my cheek. My mother pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. My father stared at his plate. No one moved. No one but me. I placed my fingertips gently on the forming bruise, lifted my chin, and looked directly at David's investors, his board members, the society wives who lunched with judges. "You just witnessed my husband commit assault. In public. On our anniversary." The manager stepped forward, phone in hand. "Ma'am, do you want me to call the police?" David's face had drained of color. He sputtered, "She provoked me." I didn't flinch. All of you saw what happened. This moment is documented. This moment is real. The air in the room shifted. The mask David had worn for a decade cracked under the weight of his own violence. His empire wasn't untouchable anymore. His audience wasn't loyal. For the first time in 10 years, I felt something strange, dangerous, electric, power. And that was when I knew the night had finally tipped. The hunter had stepped into his own trap. Lost. Together, we sharpened every detail into a blade, financial records, recordings, even the prenup David had trusted too much. A single clause buried on page 47 was all I needed, one public act of violence, witnessed by many, and his fortress of protection would collapse. And tonight, David had no idea he was standing in a hall of mirrors. Every smile he threw at investors, every dismissive word he muttered at me, it was all being catalogued. He thought he was the master of the performance. He didn't know the script had already been rewritten. As dessert plates clinked onto tables, I excused myself to the corridor. My reflection in the gilded mirror stopped me cold. My hair was perfect, my dress impeccable, but beneath it all, I saw the truth, a woman balanced between fear and fury, waiting for the exact second to tip the scales. The night hadn't reached its peak. Not yet. But the air was tightening, like a violin string drawn too far. One tug, one slip, and the sound of it snapping would echo through every corner of this room, and through the rest of David Mitchell's life. The sting on my cheek pulsed like fire, but I refused to touch it again. Touching meant acknowledging the pain, and tonight wasn't about pain, it was about proof. Around us, the restaurant remained frozen in a tableau of disbelief. Waiters clutched trays midair. Guests stared down at their plates, pretending not to witness what they could never unsee. My parents were the only ones who moved, slowly, deliberately rising from their chairs. Finally, I thought. Finally, they'll stand with me. But my mother didn't face me. She turned to David, her voice soft, apologetic. I'm so sorry. She can be difficult. The words dropped heavier than the slap itself. My father nodded, placing a hand on David's shoulder like a gesture of solidarity between men. Women get emotional, he muttered. Don't take it to heart. I swallowed hard, tasting iron at the back of my throat. Betrayal has a sound, it's the echo of your parents walking away while your abuser smirks in victory. David lifted his wine glass again, smirk curling across his face. Well-trained family I married into. They know their place. Some guests chuckled nervously. Others looked down. None left. None intervened. I stood there, tall as I could manage, fighting the instinct to shrink. My hand slipped beneath the tablecloth, fingers brushing the phone in my pocket. One word was already typed, ready to send. A single word that would summon everything I'd built in silence. Now. But still, I hesitated. Not because I doubted the plan, but because part of me, an old part, the part trained to obey, whispered, what if it isn't enough? What if he finds a way to twist this, too? David saw my hesitation and pounced. He rose from his chair, glass slamming onto the table with a sharp crack. Sit down, Hillary, he ordered, his voice booming over the hushed room. You're embarrassing yourself. No, my own voice surprised me. Low, steady, carrying farther than I thought possible. His face darkened. What did you say? I said no. For a moment, there was silence. Then, with the predictability of a storm returning to sea, his hand curled into a fist. You need another lesson. I didn't move. Fear quivered somewhere deep inside, but it no longer controlled me. Every bruise, every insult, every night I'd spent building this moment, this was the culmination. Behind me, the heavy doors of the restaurant groaned open. Heels clicked against marble, purposeful, unhurried, the sound of authority entering a room. Heads turned. Whispers swept the tables. David froze mid-step, his raised hand faltering. I didn't look at him. My gaze stayed steady, voice calm as glass. You should turn around, David. He scoffed, not breaking his glare. Don't try to distract me. But then the voice came through, crisp, cutting, undeniable. Mr. Mitchell. And suddenly, the predator looked afraid. David's knuckles were still clenched when the room shifted. Heels struck marble like a drumbeat of inevitability. Into the glow of chandeliers stepped Margaret Chen, wrapped in a black suit as precise as her expression. 3 figures followed, Diane Winters with her leather case, James Morrison observing like a hawk, and a man holding a camera that had already been rolling. The restaurant inhaled as one. Even the waitstaff stilled. Actually, Margaret said, her voice slicing through the air, it isn't private at all. This is a public establishment. And what we all just witnessed is a crime. David blinked, the arrogance draining from his face. This is none of your business. Oh, it's very much my business, Margaret replied. She lifted her phone, the screen glowing with a fresh video. 50 witnesses. High-definition footage. Shall we replay it? The blood drained from David's cheeks. He scanned the room for allies, but no one would meet his eyes. His investors leaned back. His board members typed frantically into phones. Even his friends sat paralyzed, unwilling to move toward a sinking ship. I felt my pulse steady. For 10 years, I had lived on quicksand. Tonight, I stood on bedrock. Why are you here? David demanded, desperation cracking through his voice. Margaret's smile was cold. To celebrate. She turned toward me, her words deliberate, amplifying to every corner of the restaurant. Hillary Parker, equity partner. Signed last week. Effective immediately. A wave of whispers swelled through the room. Partner. The word landed like a verdict. David's glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the marble floor. That's impossible. She's nothing. She doesn't, actually, James Morrison interjected, stepping forward. She outbilled every associate in the city last year. That acquisition she closed? $30 million in revenue. I met David's gaze then, and for the first time, he looked smaller than me. No, I said quietly, every syllable precise. I'm not nothing. I'm the reason you had anything at all. Diane Winters moved forward, unfolding crisp papers across the table like a magician revealing cards. Mr. Mitchell, you've been served. Divorce finalized. Prenup void under Clause 47. Assets frozen. Custody petition filed. Effective as of tonight. David staggered, clutching the edge of the table. You planned this. Yes, I said simply. While you thought you were breaking me, I was building this moment. The camera's red light blinked, catching every second. David's knees buckled. He sank to the floor, gripping the hem of my dress. Please, Hillary. Don't do this. I'll change. I'll get help. Think of Sophie. The restaurant held its breath. I pulled my dress free from his shaking hands. My voice didn't waver. I am thinking of her. She'll never grow up believing this is love. 2 men in dark suits appeared at the doorway, badges flashing gold. David Mitchell, one said evenly, you need to come with us. The predator who once filled every room with fear was escorted out in handcuffs. His eyes darted everywhere, searching for rescue. But no one moved. No one followed. And for the first time in a decade, I stood in the center of the room unafraid, unbroken, and entirely my own. The restaurant emptied in fragments, waiters whispering, guests filing out with eyes downcast, investors slipping away into the night. The echo of David's protests still clung to the marble, fading with every click of the FBI's shoes. And then, silence. I stood in the center of it all, the sting on my cheek now only a reminder, not a wound. My parents' chairs sat vacant, their absence louder than any betrayal. For years, their silence had been my cage. Tonight, it became my proof, I had freed myself without them. Margaret touched my shoulder. How do you feel? I searched for an answer, but none came easily. Words like victory or justice felt too small. What I felt was breath. Full, unhindered breath filling my lungs for the first time in a decade. I feel, myself, I said at last. The following weeks unfolded like a storm breaking into sunlight. David's empire collapsed in headlines and subpoenas. His boards stripped him of power, the courts stripped him of freedom. Investors abandoned him, clients vanished, friends scattered like ash. His name became shorthand for downfall, a case study in arrogance and abuse. But my story wasn't about his ruin. It was about my beginning. I moved into a new apartment with Sophie, a space filled with books, laughter, and no doors slammed in anger. At night, she read me stories instead of watching me flinch. Her drawings, taped to the fridge, showed superheroes with long hair and wide smiles. One had my name scrawled across the cape. At work, my name etched itself into the skyline, Parker and Chen. A year later, I added another name, 2 more women who, like me, had clawed their way out of silence. We built something different. A firm where talent thrived without shrinking, where survivors walked in broken and left armed. The foundation grew too. Women came with trembling hands and whispered voices, and left with plans, legal counsel, allies. I told each of them the truth that had taken me 10 years to believe: strength isn't found in enduring someone else's cruelty. It's found in refusing to let it define you. My parents tried, eventually, to come back. Therapy had softened their defenses, cracked their denial. But forgiveness is not a door that opens on demand. It is a slow untying of knots. I allowed them into Sophie's life, cautiously, with boundaries. Love, if it could return, would return on my terms. And David? Letters arrived sometimes from prison, pages of promises and regret. I never opened them. I had already buried that chapter. His words could not touch me anymore. 1 year later, I stood in my corner office, watching the city stretch into horizon. The skyline glittered, but it was not the towers or lights that struck me, it was the reflection in the glass. A woman who no longer bent. A woman who had chosen herself. My grandmother once told me, when someone shows you who they are, believe them. David showed me a monster. But tonight, the reflection showed me something else. A survivor. A mother. A partner.